Have you ever considered that it's possible to reason correctly and still come to a wrong conclusion? It's done a lot more often than you might think. What happens is that all the reasoning, which is perfectly logical, is based on a faulty premise. In fact, we have sometimes been able to deal with what we call pagan doctrines or false doctrines by simply going back to the premise. And even though all the reasoning and rationale and proof text work just fine after the premise, because the premise is wrong, the conclusion of necessity has to be wrong. But it can also happen to us. It can happen in church doctrine as easily as it can in any line of reasoning. And even in our own set of doctrines, sometimes we can reason correctly, we can argue correctly, and still come to a wrong conclusion. People commonly will take a verse out of context and then begin to develop ideas around that verse. And their ideas that they develop can be cogent and logical, and the relationships they develop with other verses can sometimes be logical. But the problem with proof texts used as a basis for doctrine is that unless you have it right to start with, unless we are certain that the context is correct, unless you are sure you understand precisely what the author, the writer, or Jesus, or whoever it was, really intended to say, all of your reasoning can lead you to a wrong conclusion. Some of this, the way in which people go about this, is sometimes leads to some very convoluted reasoning in order to make allowances for the passages that seem to say something else. In other words, you run it down to your conclusions, and all of a sudden you come to a scripture that says something that doesn't fit. And so you have to find a way of working your way around or explaining away or dealing with in some way that particular scripture. And the result sometimes is extremely complex, long, involved arguments. And as you make your way through the argument, you can't find anything wrong at any given step. And yet somewhere in the back of your mind, somewhere down inside of yourself, something is telling you this is not right. This doesn't work. This doesn't feel right. Doesn't look right. Doesn't smell right. Doesn't sound right. And the chances are, if you're a Bible reader and you've read very much of it, and you've got something down inside of you that some little switch that won't close, some little, sound that doesn't work, then the chances are there is something somewhere wrong. A true doctrine should be plain, and it should be simple, and really it should be beautiful. I was fascinated not long ago. I watched really a fine documentary on PBS about the creation of the universe. It was a discussion of all the implications of the Big Bang Theory and of quantum mechanics and all the things were very, very difficult. Some of the concepts were. And I can't at all say I got many of them together. But what I was struck by was that science is looking for a unified theory of how the cosmos works. And they know that when they find it, it will be simple. And what struck me was more than one of the scientists they interviewed said the same thing. Not only will it be simple, it will also be beautiful. I gathered that a lot of scientists are becoming uncomfortable with the picture they're now getting about subatomic particles because it is too complex, and surprisingly, as one said, it's ugly. And therefore they know that there is something in their theory that really is not right. They believe that a true, unified theory of the origins of the universe should be both simple and beautiful. Now there are, and I think probably many of you are aware of this, a lot of very complicated and ugly doctrines out there. And they are that way because they have taken a wrong turn somewhere and have had to make far too many adjustments to make it fit. And the result sometimes are papers that really, when you deal with the essence of the subject at hand, might run 3 to 4 pages. That someone winds up having to write 50, 60, or 70 pages in order to get and make his point and get it across because it's not simple and it's not plain. Now, the doctrines of any given church have by way of analogy, a family tree. You'll oftentimes, if you go to a book or a doctrinal statement, a systematic theology, you'll see them all laid out in nice, neat, clean outline form. The doctrines will be divided up into segments. Each segment will have a heading. There will be subheadings under those with all the doctrines that are related to it lined out, and so on. It goes down through it. But A far better way, I think, of trying to understand what a church's doctrinal structure looks like is not a nice, neat outline on a paper. It's a tree. A tree with all its limbs and its branches and its twigs and its leaves. More than that, a tree with its lumps and its knots and its rotten limbs, its holes in the trunk that have been gnawed by critters and by insects. It's a tree with pieces of bark knocked out lying on the ground where the woodpeckers have come along and thrown them out looking for the insects that are gnawing away at the entrails of the tree. That's a far more accurate picture of the doctrinal structure of any church than a nice, neat, systematic theology on white paper with black ink and a good organization in a book. Much more accurate. I once saw a tree, in fact, on a piece of land that I owned for a little while, that had barbed wire growing right through the middle of the tree. The fence had been there. The tree came up, and instead of knocking the fence down, the tree just accommodated it, went around the tree, and went right on up. Later on, somebody had taken the fence down, but here sticking out of the tree on two sides was a length of barbed wire still there that the tree had accommodated. I saw another tree, and I think I've seen this more than once, a tree that went straight up for about 5 feet, then took a hard right-hand turn in the trunk, went out a little ways, turned back up, and went straight as a die right up to the sky. What in the world would account for a tree doing that? Well, something a long time ago was in the way, and the tree had to grow around it. Might have been a fallen tree that was, supported by another tree over yonder. It came up under it, it said, oops, it went around it, and it went straight up, as trees after that have got to go. Whatever sidetracked the tree was long gone, but the deformed tree was still there. Now, a lot of doctrinal trees are like that. No one knows how they got the way they are, and in many cases, people don't even realize that the tree is deformed. It has always been that way, and the assumption is that's the way the tree is supposed to look. But you should understand, doctrinal trees do not spring into existence fully developed, full grown, any more than any of the oak trees that are scattered around the landscape here in East Texas appeared all at once full grown. We know that they started as an acorn. We know they sprouted out of the ground. We knew they have grown up over many, many long years to the various shapes and sizes that they are here in East Texas. We relish them. With doctrine, it happens much the same way. Someone plants an idea. He then develops his idea, like watering it. The idea may be even fertilized and cultured and developed and hopefully trained to some extent as it comes up. Someone else then will come along and begin to speak on the same subject, and he will also add his ideas to it. And as time goes on, a doctrine grows. It then branches. It puts out other branches. The branches over time become thick and heavy, and they support more branches. And so on it goes as the tree develops. It develops its own shape. And its shape oftentimes depends on the environment in which it is growing. Some pine trees that start off in the middle of a forest go way up, real thin, before they ever begin to create branches and do anything, because they're looking for the light. They're striving hard to make it up where there will be some light. And so down below, there is nothing. It's rather striking when you go into a rainforest to see how hard the trees and the plants work to get up to the light. The trees are very much affected by the environment in which they grow up. And I think doctrine tends to do much the same thing. It's affected by the environment in which that doctrine is originally developed. The time, the circumstances, what's going on in the world around it, what's important to that church, what's not important to that church, all these things are in there. And so it is today that when you look at Christianity at large, you see a wide variety of trees in all kinds of shapes and forms, but some of those shapes and forms don't make a lot of sense in today's world. Now, I would say in our tree, there has been an enormous amount of willy-nilly growth that's going on for a long period of time, and that a good, serious pruning is a long time overdue. But just as when you're pruning a tree, the same thing is true when you're correcting a doctrine. Too often, you don't cut back far enough. You're timid about it. You cut off a little here, and you cut off a little there, and you cut off something over here. Well, the truth is, you really need to go way back inside and cut it off. We worry about it. I mean, I used to, kind of trim around in my roses and worried a lot about pruning my roses until I finally bought a book and learned how it was supposed to be done. And then I got busy and went back and really cut them back to where they were supposed to be cut back to, cut them where they were supposed to be cut. And I noticed something interesting. Roses are alive, and they grow back. And so I got to where I was not afraid to cut. It was an experience akin in a way to getting my first word processor, to where I didn't have to worry about putting words down on paper because it was so easy to cut them out. And it was easy to cut them out because I knew I could put them back, and so on it went. Well, you don't really have to worry that much about trimming or pruning a doctrinal tree because it will grow back. And hopefully, when it does grow back, it will be in the shape and the form that it ought to be in, instead of running into the areas where you did not want the tree or the rose or whatever it was to go. Now, I've told you all that to tell you this. Several years ago, those of us who are of this peculiar branch of the tree, of our tree, made a significant shift that our brethren in other branches did not make. What I'm talking about is that after the split with the Worldwide Church of God in 1978, the Church of God International, which was really the big game in town apart from the Worldwide at that time, there wasn't anybody else who was really that organized and doing that much. The Church of God International made a major shift in doctrine, and when we did, we cut the branch back pretty far. In fact, I think the tree, if you want to draw the analogy out to the extent, would look a lot like some of these trees that the power line companies have been into, where they leave a huge notch out of the middle, or you've got a half a tree that goes this way and nothing that comes out toward the road. Because we went back close to the trunk of the tree and lopped off a very significant doctrine. And that doctrine has, over time, grown back. Not as the same doctrine, but the doctrinal tree has grown back to shape. But the shape this time is rather different. And a lot of people who look at some of us now who, let's say, came through the Church of God International tradition, don't understand the ways in which we differ from the churches that have more recently broken off from the Worldwide Church of God, because they did not make that particular doctrinal shift. Over the years, the main trunk of our church, that's the Worldwide Church of God, developed a major branch of doctrine that was based on a few ideas about election and calling. Three of those examples, let's say three of them from that. And from these three ideas, by the way, a major portion of the church's doctrinal structure developed. The problem was it didn't develop the way that it should have. The three branches, the three big limbs, as it were, that I want to talk about are, this is not the only day of salvation, number one. Number two, many are called, but few are chosen. Number three, no man can come to Christ except the Father draw him. Every one of those statements is true. So when you go cutting back in the tree, you can trim off every branch, every twig that comes off of those statements, but you leave those statements on the tree because those statements are right. But in the process of time, a lot of ideas grew out of those particular limbs that may not be true. Such as, from the foundation of the world, some people have been predestined by God to be called, and some have not. And the ideas that then branch off of that are that, well, you might be trying to preach the gospel to this person, or being able to tell this person about something, or let's say to two people. To one of them, it's clear as crystal. To the other one, it's just like looking through dark soup. He can't understand a word you're saying. The other one understands it clearly. The reason for this is that one of those people was predestined to be called of God, and the other one was not predestined to be called of God. This is one of the ideas that grew out of that. Another one is the reason your children did not stay in the church is because God has not called them now. And while that may have been comforting to many people, it's a branch that kind of grew off of this doctrine of election that we need to think may or may not be true. And what if it's not? Number three in this category, Jesus is the idea, Jesus did not come to save the world now, but to make an announcement of the good news of God's coming kingdom. And there's a big fallacy contained in that statement that I would have to develop on another occasion. Don't have time for it today, but the question still is here. There are a host of others that come to mind. Now, what you kind of need is a guide to pruning a tree. And for me, it was when I went down and bought a book on roses, and I found a real nice chapter in there on pruning. And so I was able to take my little chapter on pruning in the book and go out to my roses and study them a little bit and get my clippers out and go to work on my rose plants, and did a whole lot better work with them than I had been doing before I read the book. So you need a guide that tells you what to cut, what not to cut, where to cut it, and why to cut it. Okay, well, for us, our guide for pruning the doctrinal tree is easy, isn't it? It's the Bible. Not hard to come by. What you do is you read the Bible, and when you find a branch on the tree that should not be there, you cut it off, taking care to be sure that you are not sitting on the branch that you are cutting off. And you should also allow the doctrines then to grow back. Grafting works okay for roses and fruit trees, but the practice of grafting a proof text onto a limb where it doesn't belong is the cause of a great deal of misunderstanding and badly shaped and badly developed trees. Happens all the time. Let's go cut this scripture over here, we bring it over here, we put a slot in the branch, stick it in there, bind it up, and presto changeo, we've grafted one doctrine into another one. That is not the way it ought to be done. They ought to be allowed to grow naturally. Now here is the way it works. We're going to turn to Matthew chapter 22 and read one of Jesus' parables and just think in terms of what we know about doctrine, doctrinal trees, ideas and presuppositions that we carry around with us about the Bible, about what Jesus taught, and so forth. And let's see if there's anything that comes to your mind as we go through here that you might feel should be cut out of the tree. Matthew 22 and verse 1. And Jesus answered and spoke unto them by parables and said, The kingdom of heaven is like a certain king which made a marriage for his son, and sent forth his servants to call them that were bidden to the wedding, and they would not come. That's strange, the parable is. It's not what you would normally expect to take place in society. And of course, that's not what the parable is about. The parable is about the fact that God originally reached out to and invited the Israelite people to come to his wedding feast. This becomes apparent as we go along. He sent forth then other servants. You tell those that I have invited, I have prepared my dinner. My oxen and my fatlings are killed. Everything is ready. Come to the marriage. Now we all know basically the entire nation of Israel was called of God. They were his chosen people. They were a peculiar nation. And they were to be really a holy priesthood, as a matter of fact. They were to bless the entirety of the world by their presence in it. They were invited. But the problem is, they didn't come. It says they made light of it and went their way, one to his farm, another to his merchandise. And the remnant took his servants and entreated them spitefully and killed them. And that's the real tragedy of the history of Israel. As God sent prophets saying, come to the feast. And they treated the prophets very badly. In some cases, they actually killed them. So when the king heard of it, he was furious, and he sent forth his armies and destroyed those murderers and burned up their city, and Israel went into captivity. I know I'm doing some interpretation here, but I think the interpretation of this parable is very, very widely accepted across Protestant and our own theologians as well. Then he said to his servants, the wedding is ready. They that were bidden were not worthy. Go therefore into the highways, and as many as you shall find, call to the wedding. What's this all about? Obviously, it is the shift from the Israelites to the Gentiles. Really, it is the shift. The word Gentile is a funny word. It means the nations. It basically means everybody else is what it's talking about. What he is essentially saying is, we took this invitation to Israel. Israel turned it down. Now I want you to go out to the whole world and invite the whole world to come in. Now, what did he say in this? And this is, I think, an important thing for us to understand. Did he say, I want you to go out in the world and select individuals from the highways and the byways to come to my feast? Do you read that in here? Is there anything to hint at that in here? No. The expression is, as many as you shall find. What does that suggest to you? It suggests a sort of a random action involved in it, doesn't it? It's wherever the encounter is. You invite. You encounter. You invite. You encounter. You invite. And the laws of time and chance determine who you are going to encounter in the process. So those servants went out to the highways and gathered as many as they found, bad and good. And they brought them, and the wedding was furnished with guests. And the king came in to see the guests. He saw there a man that didn't have a wedding garment. And he said, "Friend, how did you come in here without a wedding garment?" And the man was speechless. And the king said to his servants, "Bind him hand and foot and take him away and cast him into outer darkness. There shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are called, but few are chosen." Now there is that little line that I mentioned to you earlier as one of the fundamental tree trunks upon which so much doctrine has been built. So many sermons and sermonettes have been given to develop the idea that many are called and few are chosen. Actually, as it turns out, the expression, "many are called but few are chosen," was a proverb of the day. It was something you would say about any type of circumstance in which you have a multitude out of which a few are picked. Many are called, few are chosen. I think someone mentioned that in the book of Esdras, the expression is used about 4 different times. It's just an aphorism that was used at the time. Jesus tacked it on the end of the parable simply to summarize what he had said before. What did he say before? Did he say, as I think, if you were to examine some people in our tradition and the way their doctrinal tree got developed, what they really believe is that few are called and hardly any are chosen. But if you read this, what comes to mind in the thing is that the invitation is scattered far and wide, isn't it? It's made available to all kinds of people. That's the many. Who actually comes to the wedding feast? That's the chosen. The ones that showed up. Who decided whether they were going to come or not? Well, they did. Because, in fact, when you go and you look at Israel out there, Israel of old, they had the choice of coming or not coming. And they chose not to come. And so he went out and invited the Gentiles. And of the Gentiles, some chose to come, enough, finally, that the wedding was furnished with all the guests. But, the thing about this is that it's very clear, I think, that the net was cast very broad, and that the calling was in the invitation that went out far and wide to all kinds of persons, irrespective of who they were or what they were like. And it's like the gospel that goes out to man, good and bad. And how oftentimes it is the bad who are willing to respond to it, whereas the good don't think they need to hear it, I guess. So the gospel was made available to the Gentiles. In what number? Was there a limited calling to the Gentiles? No. It was to as many as you could find. Now the question, I think, has to keep coming to mind, though. If many are called and few are chosen, why is it that way? Why are so few chosen? Well, according to this parable, it is because the called refused the calling. That's the reason why not many of these were chosen. So who does God call? How do we know where the calling goes? How far and wide is it? Matthew 9, verse 10. Maybe you've trimmed off a few branches out of your tree now, maybe not. Matthew 9 and verse 10. It came to pass as Jesus sat at meat in the house, behold, many publicans and sinners came and sat down with him and his disciples. And when the Pharisees saw it, they said to his disciples, "Why does your master eat with publicans and sinners?" When Jesus heard that, he said to them, "Folks, it's those that behold do not need a physician. It's people who are sick that need a physician. You go and learn what this means. I will have mercy and not sacrifice, for I am not come to call one category of people. I am come to call another category. I am not come to call the righteous. I am come to call sinners to repentance." So, who does God call? He calls sinners. How many sinners are there? There are many. Many are called. Now, we all know that this is not the only day of salvation. That's another subject. We've gone through it. I'm convinced of it and satisfied with it. So, and we also know that Jesus did not come to save the world now. But I am not comfortable with that expression at all, because I think it is misleading. I think it gets the conversation off on the wrong foot. You say, well, Jesus did not come to save the world now. What is that? Is that an excuse for our own ineffectiveness? Is it an excuse for us not actually being diligent and trying to save what we can out of the world? For think about that. If he didn't come to save the world, then who did he come to save? Or, if he didn't come to save the world, did he come to save anybody? I think that's a fair question. In Luke 19, you don't even need to turn to this one, it's so short. Verse 10, for the Son of Man is come to... Now, if you ever wanted to know why Jesus came, did he come to bear the gospel? Did he come with a message from the Father? He come to make an announcement of the coming kingdom of God? Is that what Jesus came to do? No. The Son of Man is come to seek and to save that which was lost. Who's he after? Who does he want? The lost. Who's that? Well, it's most people. He did not come to call the righteous. He came to call sinners. He came to call the lost. He didn't come looking for the religious establishment. He came looking for the poor, dirty, rotten sinners out there in the world. And here's another thing. And I don't know how this branch got grown off of the basic original idea. That just because we can't save everybody doesn't mean we shouldn't try to save somebody. Right? It's like saying, well, there are, 1,500 people on that big ocean liner that hit the iceberg, and we've only got room in the lifeboats for 500. So I guess we're all going to have to die. Does that make sense to you? Or doesn't it make sense to do what you can with what you have and where you are and however you can? Well, logically, the human mind is designed by God to operate with a certain system of logic. Logic tells you just because you can't save everything doesn't mean you couldn't save some. Just because my house is burning down and I'm going to lose most of what I have doesn't mean there aren't a few things I can get out of there, right? Well, people are more important than the things that can be saved out of a burning house. I want you to listen to Paul's development of the theme of the marriage supper, where Jesus talks about people being invited and coming or not coming. Because Paul picks up on that in the 11th chapter of Romans and kind of develops the idea. He says, I say then, has God cast away his people? Paul was very troubled because he had gone again and again to the synagogue to preach the gospel, and again he'd gotten thrown out. Hardly anybody listened to him. I mean, one or two people here. And when he left, he preached to the Gentiles, and the Gentiles listened. Well, he was very worried by this, and he says in 11:1 of Romans, for I am an Israelite, the seed of Abraham of the tribe of Benjamin. God has not cast away his people whom he foreknew. Don't you realize what the Scripture said of Elijah? How he made intercession to God for Israel, saying, Lord, they have killed your prophets, dig down your altars, and I am left alone, and they seek my life. And how did God answer? When he thought, I am the only one. He said, I have reserved to myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to the image of Baal. Now, who made the decision that those men would not bow the knee to Baal? Every one of them. God says, I have reserved these men to myself. But every one of those men had a choice to bow or not bow. And God reserved to himself that 7,000 men who had made the decision not to bow to Baal. Even so, at this present time, there is a remnant according to the election of grace. If it's by grace, it's not a matter of works. Otherwise, grace is no more grace. What then? Israel has not obtained that which he seeks for, but the election has obtained it, and the rest were blinded. Now, right here we come to a bit of a problem. Because Paul's developing theme here is the same one as the wedding supper of the Lamb. Invite these guests to come. And they are invited, and they don't come. And then the opportunity to come is closed to them from the time that they turn down the opportunity. They are no longer allowed to come. The door is closed. The Gentiles are invited to come to this wedding feast. These are the people who have come. The rest were cut off. That's the message. But when were they cut off? They were cut off after their decision to turn down the call, not before. And so he said, because everywhere Paul went, he went to the synagogue, and he preached Christ. That calling, every person in that synagogue was called. Do you understand that? Many are called.
When Paul came in and told them what he told them, they were all invited to the wedding feast. And the majority of them turned him down, just like the parable said they would. Only a handful out of the synagogue ever stayed with Paul. But then he spoke to the Gentiles, and the Gentiles received the word gladly, and they came along, and they furnished the wedding supper of the Lamb. The election, he says, obtained it. The rest were blinded. I want you to keep something very firmly in mind here. The old saw, many are called, but few are chosen. Those invited to the wedding are the ones who are called. Those who are chosen are the elect. I have read some stuff on this by people, and it's very obvious for me that they are confusing the calling of God with the election of God. It's almost as though when I read what people write, or what they say about some of these things, they are saying that when you're called, you are chosen. It's almost as though few are called and that same few are chosen, that the call and the choosing, the call and the election are the same thing. It's a predestinarian type of doctrine. As God predestines you to be called, He calls you, you respond to the call, He justifies you, He brings you on, finally He saves you, glorifies you, and brings you into His kingdom. That seems to be the assumption that has grown up just like wildly growing limbs and branches on a tree without anybody thinking, does we really want this tree growing into this power line? The fact of the matter is that the elect are the chosen, the few. The many are the called. And the choice that leads to whether a person then is chosen or not has to do with the response to the calling. How hard is this? I would think it would be very simple. But you will be surprised. I think most of you here probably would already agree with me on this particular point. You would be surprised how many people out there who don't, who have another view of the calling and of the election of God. So, why does God choose only some of those who call, that He calls? Because of their response. Paul continues in Romans 11, verse 8. As it is written, God has given them the spirit of slumber, eyes that they should not see, ears that they should not hear unto this day. But wait, doesn't it say that God gave them that spirit of slumber? Doesn't it say that He didn't want them to hear? David said, let their table be made a snare and a trap and a stumbling block and a recompense. Let their eyes be darkened that they may not see, and bow down their back always. Doesn't that suggest that God closed their eyes and shut them off? Well, yeah, absolutely. But listen to Jesus' interpretation of the same passage out of Isaiah. Because after all, Paul's got one understanding, and we understand part of this thing from Paul. But I don't think we want to leave Jesus' interpretation out of the picture. Matthew 13, verse 10. This is in a part, along with the famous parable of the sower and the seed, which has a lot of interest to us. Matthew 13, verse 10. The disciples came and said to Him, why do you speak to them in parables? He answered and said to them, because it is given to you to know the mysteries of the kingdom of God, but to them it is not given. Okay, we've got a crowd here. It's given to these, it's not given to these. For whoever has, to him shall be given, and he shall have more abundance. But whoever has not, from him shall be taken away even what he has. Therefore I speak to them in parables, because they seeing not, and hearing they hear not, and neither do they understand. And in them is fulfilled the prophecy of Isaiah, which says, by hearing you shall hear and not understand, seeing you shall see and not perceive. But listen, for this people's heart is waxed gross, their ears are dull of hearing, and their eyes they have closed. None of this darkening of the heart, none of this blinding of the eyes, none of this turning of people away, none of this closing of the door in front of people happens before they close their eyes. No one can say, I'm not responsible. Now, the mercy of God is the reason why we say this is not the only day of salvation. And His mercy is all-encompassing. But for right now, there are many people who do get shut up. Now, my question to you is, who do you think you are to decide who should hear and who should not? Who do we think we are to decide whose eyes God has closed. Because the truth is, I could sit down and talk to you today about some particular item that we believe out of the Bible. I could explain it to you, and you could sit there with a blank expression on your face and go away with absolutely no response, and I could say, well, God hadn't called me on him, and I may not ever try you again. And you go home and open up your Bible, study, pray, and after some little period of time you think, maybe he's right. How can I decide that God has closed your eyes? How can I decide? That's not my call, is it? It's your call. It's the call of the person we preach to. And the fact is, Paul didn't think it was his call to say, well, this is a bunch of hard-nosed people in this synagogue. There's no point in talking to them. That wasn't his call. He went in and preached. And when he preached in the synagogue, the call had reached every man, woman, and child within the ears of Paul, hearing of Paul's voice. They were called. Few were chosen because very few of them were willing to listen. God only blinds a man after he has hardened his own heart and refused to hear. In them is fulfilled the prophecy of Isaiah. I say then, have they stumbled that they should fall? Paul asks. Oh my, no. God forbid, but rather through their fall salvation has come to the Gentiles to provoke them to jealousy. Now if the fall of them be the riches of the world, and the diminishing of them the riches of the Gentiles, how much more their fullness? For I speak to you Gentiles, inasmuch as I am the apostle of the Gentiles, I magnify my office, if by any means I may provoke to emulation those who are of my flesh, and might, you ready for this? Save some of them. Paul actually used the word save as a verb after his own first person pronoun. I might save. Now, most of our doctrinal structure would tend to say, no, you can't save anybody. Well, cut that branch out of the tree. Paul said, I make certain decisions. I make certain arguments. I try to do things in a certain way so that maybe somehow, some way, I might save some people. You know, hearkening back for just a moment to the parable of the sower and the seed that Jesus was, where he made this statement about their eyes being closed. You remember the example that was given? A sower goes forth, he's got his bag of seed, and he starts throwing seed all over the place. And some of it falls on the hard roadstead, some of it falls in the ditch, some of it falls among thorns, some of it falls on good ground. And then sprouts and brings forth. Now I want to ask you, in that, which would be the called and which would be the chosen? It's not hard, is it? Everybody where the seed fell was called. Only those that sprouted and brought forth fruit were the chosen. They are the elect of God. The others were not. What does that tell you then about the calling? It tells you that the calling is a very wide thing indeed. And it's rather random. Because this is not what any intelligent farmer would do. He'd be very careful, try to be sure all of his seed got in good ground. But this is scattered all over the place because God says, I never know where I may find this or that, or find somebody who... We broadcast the seed. Wherever it sprouts, whatever comes up, that's what we work with. Well, in 1 Corinthians, as I said, this whole thing requires the pruning of a branch that says we cannot, by our efforts, save anybody. It requires we lop off any branch, no matter how sturdy, that says what we do does not make a difference. Any branch that says what we do doesn't make a difference needs to get cut out of your tree. 1 Corinthians 9 and verse 16. Paul says, though I preach the gospel, I have nothing to glory upon because necessity is laid upon me. Woe, in fact, to me, if I don't preach the gospel. For if I do this thing willingly, I have a reward. If it's against my will, well, I just have my marching orders. So what is my reward? How can I get a reward out of what I'm doing? Verily that, when I preach the gospel, I may make the gospel of Christ without charge, so that I do not abuse my power in the gospel. For though I be free from all men, I have made myself servant unto all, that I might gain the more. Now you realize what Paul is saying here? He is saying that decisions that he made about how he conducted his ministry would make a difference in whether he gained more or gained less. Less what? More what? Well, I suppose people saved. I suppose the numbers of the elect in God's kingdom. I suppose that's what he's talking about. What else would it be? To the Jews I became as a Jew, that I might gain the Jews. To them that are under the law, as under the law, that I might gain them that are under the law. To them that are outside the law, well, as outside the law. Although I want you to know, I was not without the law to God. I was under the law to Christ. I did this so that I could gain them that are without the law. To the weak I became as weak, that I might gain the weak. I am made all things to all men. And why did I do this? That I might by all means save some. Now that's a very profound and full statement. Even the word means is significant, because it suggests the choice of one means or another means of trying to save people. It also suggests a deliberate, with intelligent forethought, plan to save people. Something that one doctrinal limb would say we're not supposed to try to do. Well, Paul never read that. Paul was blissfully unaware of that. Paul's doctrine of election said that there are a lot of people who are going to live or die based upon whether or not I conduct my ministry in a certain way. What I do makes a difference. This I do, he said, for the gospel's sake, that I might be partaker with you. Don't you know that they that run in a race all run, but one receives the prize? Then run, so you can obtain. Now I worry sometimes that we have used the doctrines that I cited above. This is not the only day of salvation. Many are called, but few are chosen. No man can come to Christ except the Father draw him. I worry that sometimes we use them as an excuse for our failure to bear fruit. I don't know how those doctrines developed fully. I think it would be a really interesting study to go back, if one could trace the lines of thought in all the literature of the past, to see how they came about. I really don't know how they came about. But I do know that many of the things that have grown out of this have grown out willy-nilly and really don't belong in the doctrinal structure of the church. Jesus said this, "Beware of false prophets that come to you in sheep's clothing. Inwardly they are ravening wolves. You will know them by their fruits. Do men gather grapes of thorns, or do they gather figs off of a thistle tree? Even so, every good tree brings forth good fruit. A corrupt tree brings forth evil fruit. A good tree cannot bring forth evil fruit, neither can a corrupt tree bring forth good fruit. Every tree that brings not good fruit is cut down and cast into the fire. Wherefore by their fruit you shall know them." Now, that is very sobering to think about to me. The very idea that, the fruits that you bear, the things that you accomplish, and you do these things, and you have to understand when he says this, the question of bearing fruit or not bearing fruit is not an accident. It's based upon the choices, the decisions, the means that you have at your disposal, you use, and whether or not you do make a difference anywhere or whether you don't. These things, this matter of bearing fruit seems to be a matter of choice. And if you bear fruit, fine. Your tree will be pruned and cut back. If you don't, it's going to be cut down and used for firewood. Later he says in John 15, "I am the true vine, and my Father is the husbandman. Every branch in me that bears not fruit, he takes away. Every branch that bears fruit, he purges it. He prunes it, that it may bring forth more fruit." Excuse me. "Now you are clean through the word that I have spoken to you. You remain in me as and I in you. The branch cannot bear fruit of itself except it abide in the vine." And that's a key. Right, we can't do this all by ourselves, but that doesn't mean we don't have anything to do. And it's a funny all or nothing mentality we sometimes have. I don't do it all, I guess I don't do any of it, and that doesn't follow, does it? "Abide in me as I in you. The branch cannot bear fruit of itself except it abide in the vine. No more can you, except you abide in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. He that abides in me, and I in him, the same brings forth much fruit. For without me, you can do nothing. If a man abide not in me, he is cast forth as a branch and is withered, and men gather them and cast them into the fire, and they are burned." Somewhere Jesus made a statement, "Now the axe is laid to the root of every tree, and It just rings in my mind at this particular point in time. And to look at ourselves, to think of ourselves, and to think of how our doctrinal tree even may have interfered with bearing fruit, may have kept us from even pursuing the line that would have caused us to bear fruit because of certain other wrong assumptions that we have made. But really, the choice is ours, and it's out there ahead of us. Are we going to bear fruit, or are we going to be firewood?